Marcus Chen had no idea that his routine Tuesday morning walk with Buster would change everything he thought he knew about his past. The golden retriever mix pulled eagerly at his leash, nose twitching at the familiar scents of Riverside Park in downtown Portland. What started as an ordinary day would end with Marcus discovering a 20-year military secret that had been walking beside him all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung low over the Willamette River as Marcus adjusted his coffee cup in one hand and kept a firm grip on Buster's leash with the other. At 34, Marcus had settled into a comfortable routine as a software engineer for a local tech startup. His biggest concerns usually revolved around debugging code and making sure Buster got enough exercise in their cramped downtown apartment. Buster, a 3-year-old rescue with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that shimmered between gold and amber in the morning light, had been Marcus's constant companion since he'd adopted him from the Oregon Humane Society 18 months ago. The dog had come with minimal backstory, found wandering Highway 26 with no collar, no microchip, and what the shelter workers described as unusually disciplined behavior for a stray. Marcus had connected with Buster immediately. There was something different about this dog. While other rescue animals at the shelter seemed anxious or overly eager for attention, Buster had sat calmly in his kennel, watching Marcus with an alertness that seemed almost human. When Marcus opened the kennel door, Buster had walked out with perfect heel positioning, as if he'd been trained by a professional. "Probably had a good family before," the shelter volunteer had explained. "Some dogs just retain their training better than others." This particular Tuesday morning felt different from the start. Marcus had woken up earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by Buster's low whining at the bedroom door. The dog rarely made noise, so Marcus had quickly gotten dressed and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The city was still quiet, with only the occasional delivery truck rumbling past and the distant sound of the Max Light Rail beginning its morning routes. They were walking their usual path along the river when Marcus noticed the convoy. 3 olive-green military vehicles were parked near the boat launch, and several soldiers in camouflage uniforms were setting up equipment. It wasn't entirely unusual. Fort Vancouver was only a few miles away across the Columbia River in Washington, and military exercises occasionally spilled over into the Portland area. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't the soldiers, but the dogs. 4 German Shepherds sat in perfect formation beside their handlers, their attention focused and disciplined in a way that reminded him of Buster's unusual composure. These were clearly working dogs, military K-9 units based on the specialized harnesses and the way the soldiers interacted with them. Marcus was about to continue on his usual route when something extraordinary happened. Buster, who had been trotting alongside him with his typical easy gait, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The dog's entire body went rigid, his ears perked forward, and his tail dropped to a neutral position. Then, without any command from Marcus, Buster sat down and assumed what could only be described as a perfect attention stance. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Marcus muttered, tugging gently on the leash. But Buster didn't budge. That's when Marcus noticed the military dogs. All 4 German Shepherds had turned their heads in Buster's direction. Their handlers, deep in conversation about their training exercise, hadn't noticed yet, but the dogs clearly had. One by one, they began to shift their positions, their attention moving from their handlers to the golden retriever sitting 50 yards away. Sergeant First Class Williams was the first handler to notice the change in his dog's behavior. Rex, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with an impressive service record, had suddenly gone from relaxed alertness to focused attention, his gaze fixed on something beyond the immediate training area. "Rex, what is it?" Williams asked, following his dog's line of sight. That's when he saw the civilian with the golden retriever. The dog was sitting in a textbook military attention position, back straight, head up, eyes forward. It was the kind of posture that took months of intensive training to achieve, yet here was what appeared to be a pet dog, displaying perfect military bearing. Williams nudged his partner, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose dog Luna had also locked on to the golden retriever. "You seeing this?" Rodriguez followed Williams's gaze and felt his eyebrows raise. In his 12 years as a military dog handler, he'd seen plenty of well-trained civilian dogs, but this was different. The Golden Retriever's posture wasn't just good, it was identical to what they drilled into their combat dogs during basic training. That's unusual, Rodriguez admitted. The other two handlers, Corporal Johnson and Specialist Martinez, had noticed their dog's distraction as well. All 4 military K-9s were now sitting at attention, their focus entirely on the Golden Retriever across the park. It was unprecedented behavior. These dogs were trained to maintain focus on their handlers and immediate environment, not to be distracted by civilian pets. Marcus stood there, increasingly uncomfortable as he became aware that he and Buster had somehow become the center of attention for an entire military K-9 unit. The soldiers were now openly staring in their direction, and he could see them talking among themselves, occasionally pointing. "Come on, Buster, let's go," Marcus said, tugging the leash more firmly. But the dog remained motionless, as if he hadn't heard the command at all. This was completely out of character. Buster was usually responsive to voice commands and had never ignored Marcus's directions. The dog's breathing was steady, his eyes alert, and everything about his posture suggested he was waiting for something. But what? Sergeant Williams made a decision. He handed Rex's leash to Rodriguez and began walking across the grass toward the civilian and his dog. As he approached, he could see the Golden Retriever's training more clearly. The dog's positioning was flawless, weight evenly distributed, head at the correct angle. Even his tail placement was textbook perfect. "Excuse me, sir," Williams called out when he was about 20 feet away. Marcus turned, his anxiety spiking. He'd never been in trouble with the military before, and he couldn't imagine what he might have done wrong. "Yes?" "I'm Sergeant Williams. I couldn't help but notice your dog's posture. That's some impressive training." Marcus looked down at Buster, who hadn't moved a muscle. "I honestly have no idea what's gotten into him. He's never done this before." Williams studied the Golden Retriever more carefully. There were subtle signs that most civilians wouldn't recognize, but that jumped out to anyone familiar with military dog training. The exact angle of the head, the way the dog's weight was distributed, even the controlled breathing pattern, it all pointed to extensive tactical training. "Where did you get him?" Williams asked. "Oregon Humane Society, about 18 months ago. He was a stray found on Highway 26 with no identification." Williams felt a chill run down his spine. Highway 26 led directly to several military installations, including some classified training facilities that most people didn't know existed. He'd heard rumors about dogs that had gone missing during transport between facilities, but those were usually dismissed as administrative mix-ups. Has he ever displayed any other unusual behaviors, responses to specific commands, maybe in different languages? Marcus shook his head, though something nagged at the back of his memory. There had been a few incidents, times when Buster had reacted to sounds that Marcus couldn't hear, or moments when the dog had seemed to be listening for something specific. Marcus had always attributed it to Buster's keen senses, but now he was beginning to wonder. Williams pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the sergeant's expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When Williams hung up, he looked at Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been concerning. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you a few more questions about your dog. This might sound strange, but based on what I'm seeing here, there's a possibility that Buster might have some history that you're not aware of." Marcus felt his world beginning to shift. The comfortable routine of his life with Buster suddenly seemed less certain, and questions he'd never thought to ask were beginning to surface. What exactly had happened during those unknown months before Buster ended up at the shelter? And why were 4 highly trained military dogs treating his rescue pet like he was one of their own? Within minutes, 2 additional military vehicles arrived at Riverside Park. Marcus watched with growing unease as more personnel emerged, including a woman in an officer's uniform who carried herself with unmistakable authority. Buster remained frozen in his attention stance, seemingly oblivious to the commotion building around him. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan had received Williams's call at Fort Vancouver and immediately understood the implications. For the past 3 years, she'd been heading a classified investigation into missing military assets, including several highly trained K-9s that had disappeared during a transport incident in 2022. The official report had classified them as casualties of a vehicle accident, but Brennan had always suspected there was more to the story. "Mr. Chen, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Brennan," she said, extending her hand as she approached. I understand you found this dog as a stray approximately 18 months ago? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. The formal tone and the increasing military presence made him feel like he was being interrogated for a crime he didn't know he'd committed. Yes, ma'am. The shelter said he was found wandering Highway 26. Brennan exchanged a meaningful look with Sergeant Williams. Highway 26 was the exact route that Transport Unit Delta 7 had been traveling when they'd gone off the road during a winter storm in February 2022. The official investigation had concluded that the vehicle had skidded on black ice and gone into the Clackamas River. 2 handlers had been rescued, but 3 military working dogs were presumed drowned when their transport kennels were swept downstream. Has Buster ever responded to any specific verbal commands that seemed unusual to you? Brennan asked carefully. Marcus thought for a moment. Well, there was this one time about 6 months ago. I was watching a war movie, and when one of the characters shouted something in German, Buster immediately dropped into this low crawl position. I thought it was weird, but I figured maybe he was just reacting to the loud voice. Brennan felt her pulse quicken. Advanced tactical dogs were often trained with commands in multiple languages to prevent enemy forces from controlling them if captured. German commands were standard in many specialized units. Do you remember what the command was? Something like Kriechen? I'm not sure of the pronunciation. Kriechen, Brennan repeated, and immediately Buster dropped from his sitting position into a perfect low crawl, his belly touching the ground while maintaining forward alertness. Marcus stepped backward, his coffee cup slipping from his hand and hitting the ground with a splash. What the hell just happened? Mr. Chen, I believe your dog is Atlas. The name hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus stared at Brennan, then down at Buster or Atlas, who had remained in the crawl position, awaiting his next command. Atlas was part of an elite K-9 unit specializing in explosive detection and tactical support, Brennan continued. He was being transported to a new assignment when the vehicle carrying him went off the road during a blizzard. We searched for weeks, but the river was running high from the snowmelt, and we eventually had to classify him as killed in action. Marcus felt dizzy. The friendly, gentle dog who slept at the foot of his bed and got excited about tennis balls was apparently a highly trained military operative with a service record and a different name entirely. But how is that possible? He's so normal. He plays fetch, he begs for table scraps, he's afraid of the mailman. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a military veterinarian who had arrived with Brennan's team, stepped forward. Military working dogs are trained to compartmentalize their behaviors. In a civilian environment, without the specific triggers and commands that activate their tactical training, they can appear to be ordinary pets. It's actually a testament to Atlas's training that he adapted so well to civilian life. Atlas, Auf, Brennan commanded, and the dog immediately returned to sitting position. Marcus watched in stunned silence as the dog he thought he knew responded to commands in a language he didn't speak. So what happens now? Do you just take him back? The question created an uncomfortable silence among the military personnel. Technically, Atlas was government property, a highly valuable asset that had cost taxpayers over $150,000 to train. But the legal and ethical implications of removing a dog from a civilian who had cared for him for 18 months were complex. That's not a decision I can make in the field, Brennan admitted. There are protocols to follow, legal considerations. Atlas has clearly bonded with you, and you've provided him with excellent care. Dr. Walsh knelt down beside Atlas and began a quick physical examination. He's in excellent condition, she reported. Well fed, properly exercised, good muscle tone. His teeth have been cleaned recently, and his coat is healthy. Mr. Chen, you've taken very good care of him. Marcus felt a surge of protective anger. Of course I have. He's my dog. I love him. We understand that, Brennan said gently, and we're not here to simply confiscate him. But you have to understand the situation from our perspective as well. Atlas isn't just any dog. He's been trained in skills that have significant national security implications. His disappearance was a major loss to our program. Specialist Martinez, one of the younger handlers, had been quietly observing the interaction between Marcus and Atlas. Ma'am, permission to speak? Quote. Brennan nodded. The dog's behavior suggests strong civilian bonding. Look at his positioning. Even while responding to military commands, he keeps orienting toward Mr. Chen. His loyalty has been transferred. This observation sparked a heated discussion among the military personnel. Atlas represented a significant investment in training and capability, but forcing his return to military service after such extensive civilian bonding could potentially damage his effectiveness as a working dog. Meanwhile, Marcus was processing the revelation that his quiet morning routine had been shared with what was essentially a K-9 Special Forces operative. "Can I ask what kind of work he did?" Atlas was trained in explosive detection, tactical reconnaissance, and high-risk insertion support, Brennan explained. He served 2 deployments overseas and was being reassigned to a domestic counterterrorism unit when the transport accident occurred. Marcus looked down at Atlas, who was now sitting calmly but keeping one eye on Marcus and one on Lieutenant Colonel Brennan. "He saves lives." "Saved lives," Brennan corrected. His active duty status was terminated when he was declared KIA. Dr. Walsh had continued her examination and made an interesting discovery. "Colonel, he still has his microchip. It was probably missed at the shelter because it's a military-grade chip that requires specific scanning equipment." The revelation that Atlas had been walking around Portland with active military identification embedded under his skin for 18 months added another layer of complexity to the situation. If the shelter had possessed the proper scanning equipment, Atlas would have been returned to military custody immediately. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Based on the scarring pattern I'm seeing on his hindquarters, Atlas didn't just survive the transport accident. He was injured. These look like impact wounds that have healed over time. He probably crawled out of that river, injured and disoriented, and wandered for days or weeks before someone found him." The image of Atlas, wounded and alone in the Oregon wilderness, struggling to survive after losing his handlers and his purpose, hit Marcus like a physical blow. He was hurt, and no one was looking for him. "We were looking," Brennan said quietly, "but the search area was massive, and the weather conditions were terrible. After 2 weeks with no trace, the decision was made to focus resources elsewhere." Marcus knelt down and placed his hand on Atlas's head. The dog immediately leaned into the touch, a gesture of trust and affection that had become as natural as breathing over their months together. "What kind of injuries?" "Blunt force trauma, probably from being thrown around inside the transport vehicle during the crash. Some lacerations that suggest he had to break out of his kennel. He's fully healed now, but it would have been painful and frightening for him at the time." The military personnel watched as Marcus processed this information. Here was a man who had unknowingly provided rehabilitation and love to a traumatized war dog, giving Atlas the time and space he needed to heal both physically and emotionally. "Mr. Chen," Brennan said finally, "I think we need to have a longer conversation about Atlas's future. This situation is more complicated than a simple case of lost property recovery." 3 hours later, Marcus found himself in a conference room at Fort Vancouver that he never imagined he'd see. Atlas lay quietly beside his chair, occasionally lifting his head to scan the room with professional alertness that Marcus was only now beginning to recognize as military training rather than natural caution. Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, had been briefed on the situation and arrived with a folder thick with documents, legal precedents, and policy manuals. Across the table sat Major Patricia Coleman from the Judge Advocate General's office, whose job was to navigate the legal complexities of a case that had no clear precedent. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison began, "we're dealing with a unique situation here. Atlas is technically government property, but Mr. Chen has unknowingly provided care that likely saved his life and certainly contributed to his psychological recovery." Major Coleman opened her folder. "I've researched similar cases, and while there have been instances of military working dogs being adopted by their handlers after retirement, there's no precedent for a situation where a civilian inadvertently rescued and rehabilitated a dog who was presumed dead." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The formal military environment felt surreal after 18 months of casual morning walks and evening games of fetch. "What are my options here?" "That depends on several factors," Coleman replied. "Atlas's current psychological state, his potential fitness for continued military service, and, frankly, the public relations implications of forcibly removing a beloved pet from a civilian who acted in good faith." Dr. Walsh had spent the morning conducting comprehensive behavioral and medical evaluations of Atlas. Her findings painted a complex picture of a dog caught between two worlds. Atlas shows clear retention of his military training, she reported. His response time to tactical commands is still within acceptable parameters, and his physical conditioning remains excellent. However, he's also developed strong civilian behavioral patterns and emotional bonds that would be difficult to break without causing significant psychological stress. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan leaned forward. Dr. Walsh, in your professional opinion, would returning Atlas to active duty be detrimental to his well-being? It's complicated. Atlas has essentially lived two lives, his military service and his civilian recovery. Forcing him to abandon his civilian identity could trigger anxiety, depression, or behavioral regression. On the other hand, he clearly retains his professional instincts and might thrive in a structured military environment. Marcus listened to them discuss Atlas's future, as if he were a piece of equipment rather than a living being with preferences and emotions. Can I ask Atlas what he wants? The question drew surprised looks from the military personnel, but Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. Actually, that's not as ridiculous as it sounds. We can observe his behavioral responses to different scenarios and get a sense of his preferences. Colonel Morrison stood up. Let's conduct a practical evaluation. We'll expose Atlas to both military and civilian scenarios and document his responses. They moved to a training facility where Sergeant Williams and his team had set up various stations. The first test involved Atlas working alongside the other military K-9s in a simulated explosive detection exercise. Within minutes, Atlas had fallen into perfect synchronization with the team, his movements precise and confident as he methodically searched a mock building setup. Look at his body language, Dr. Walsh observed. Ears forward, tail neutral, focused breathing. He's completely engaged and clearly enjoying the mental stimulation. Quote, but when Marcus called Atlas's civilian name Buster from across the training area, the dog's head immediately turned, his tail wagged, and he took several steps toward Marcus before catching himself and returning to military bearing. The second test placed Atlas in a civilian environment, a mock living room setup with furniture, toys, and normal household items. Marcus sat on the couch and patted his leg, and Atlas immediately trotted over, jumped up beside him, and settled in with a contented sigh. Completely different dog, Brennan observed. Relaxed posture, casual movement, seeking physical contact for comfort rather than maintaining professional distance. Major Coleman was taking notes furiously. This behavioral flexibility could actually work in our favor legally. It demonstrates that Atlas has successfully adapted to civilian life, which strengthens Mr. Chen's position if this goes to court. The final test was the most revealing. They placed Atlas in the middle of the room with Marcus on one side and Sergeant Williams on the other. Both men called to the dog simultaneously, Marcus using Buster and Williams using Atlas, along with the German command for come. Atlas looked back and forth between them, his confusion evident. He took a step toward Williams, then turned and walked to Marcus, but kept looking back at the military handler. Finally, he sat down exactly halfway between them and let out a small whine of distress. He's torn, Dr. Walsh said quietly. He recognizes both identities as legitimate parts of himself, but he can't reconcile them in this context. The demonstration had a profound effect on everyone present. Colonel Morrison cleared his throat. It seems to me that we're asking the wrong question. Instead of deciding whether Atlas belongs in military or civilian life, perhaps we should be asking how both aspects of his identity can be honored. Major Coleman looked up from her notes. What are you suggesting, sir? A hybrid arrangement. Mr. Chen keeps custody of Atlas as his civilian companion, but Atlas also serves as a reserve K-9 unit member, participating in training exercises and being available for deployment in emergency situations. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. You mean I could keep him, but he'd still be a soldier? More like a civilian contractor with specialized skills, Morrison clarified. Atlas would live with you, maintaining his civilian identity as Buster, but report for duty when needed. It's unprecedented, but then again, so is this entire situation. Brennan was already thinking through the logistics. We'd need to establish protocols for his transition between civilian and military modes, regular training sessions to maintain his skills, and clear guidelines about when he could be activated for service. Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly. From a psychological perspective, this could actually be ideal. Atlas gets to maintain both aspects of his identity rather than being forced to suppress one or the other. But what about the legal issues? Marcus asked. If he's still military property. Joint custody, Major Coleman said, warming to the idea. The military retains ownership for legal purposes but grants you permanent guardianship for civilian life. Think of it as a long-term adoption with conditions. Atlas had been watching the conversation with alert interest, his head turning to follow each speaker as if he understood the stakes involved. When Colonel Morrison stood up and walked over to him, Atlas automatically assumed attention. Atlas, Morrison said formally, then looked at Marcus. Call him. Buster, come here, boy, Marcus said softly. Atlas looked between them once more, then made his choice. He walked to Marcus first, pressing against his leg affectionately, then turned and walked to Morrison, sitting at attention but with his tail wagging slightly. I think he's telling us he wants both, Morrison said with a smile. The paperwork took another 2 hours to complete. Marcus found himself signing documents that made him something between a pet owner and a military contractor. Atlas would undergo monthly training sessions to maintain his tactical skills. In exchange, Marcus received a military ID card that would allow him access to base veterinary services and training facilities. One more thing, Brennan said as they prepared to leave. Atlas's military service record shows he was awarded a medal for heroism during his second deployment. He detected an IED that would have killed 6 soldiers. That medal was never presented because he was presumed dead. She opened a small box and removed a distinguished service medal designed specifically for military working dogs. I think it's time he received proper recognition. As Brennan pinned the medal to a new collar, Atlas sat perfectly still, somehow understanding the solemnity of the moment. When she finished, he looked up at Marcus with what could only be described as pride. Walking back to his car, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in a single morning. Buster was still Buster, the gentle, loving companion who would sleep at the foot of his bed tonight. But he was also Atlas, a decorated war hero with skills and experiences that Marcus was only beginning to understand. As they drove back into Portland, Atlas rested his head on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture that was purely civilian, purely Buster. But Marcus noticed that the dog's eyes continued to scan their surroundings with professional alertness, and he realized that Atlas had never really stopped being a soldier. He'd simply learned to be something more. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a clear autumn sky. Marcus scratched behind Atlas's ears and smiled. Well, boy, I guess we're both going to have to learn some new tricks. Atlas's tail wagged, and for the first time since that morning, Marcus felt certain that everything was going to work out exactly as it should. 2 weeks later, Marcus discovered just how much his world had expanded. The first joint training session at Fort Vancouver opened his eyes to capabilities he never knew Atlas possessed. Under the guidance of Sergeant Williams, Atlas demonstrated detection skills that bordered on supernatural. Hidden explosive devices that Marcus couldn't even see were located within minutes through Atlas's methodical search patterns. He's reading scent cones, Williams explained as they watched Atlas work. The way explosive particles disperse in air currents creates invisible trails that trained dogs can follow like road maps. Atlas is essentially seeing a three-dimensional map of dangerous materials that's completely invisible to us. Marcus watched in fascination as Atlas approached a seemingly empty cardboard box, paused 3 feet away, then sat and stared directly at Williams, the signal for a positive detection. Inside the box, Williams revealed a training device no larger than a coin that Marcus would have walked past without a second thought. During his deployment in Afghanistan, Atlas detected over 40 improvised explosive devices, Dr. Walsh explained. Each successful find potentially saved dozens of lives. The cognitive processing required for this level of work is extraordinary. He's essentially performing complex chemical analysis through scent interpretation. But what struck Marcus most was watching Atlas transition between his military and civilian personas. During training exercises, he moved with crisp efficiency, his entire demeanor focused and professional. The moment the session ended and Marcus called Buster, the transformation was immediate. Relaxed posture, playful energy, and that familiar golden retriever enthusiasm for simple pleasures like tennis balls and belly rubs. It's remarkable, Dr. Walsh observed during one of their sessions. Most working dogs struggle to compartmentalize different behavioral modes, but Atlas switches between them seamlessly. He's essentially living as two different dogs in the same body. The arrangement brought unexpected benefits to Marcus's civilian life as well. His new military ID granted him access to base facilities, including an advanced veterinary clinic where Atlas received care that would have cost thousands of dollars in the civilian world. More importantly, Marcus began to understand the depth of the bond between military handlers and their dogs. "These animals aren't just tools," Sergeant Williams explained during one of their conversations. "They're partners in the truest sense. In combat situations, the trust between handler and dog can mean the difference between life and death for everyone involved." Marcus learned that Atlas had served with 3 different handlers during his military career. Staff Sergeant Kevin Torres had been Atlas's primary handler during his first deployment, where they'd worked together for 14 months in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. Torres had been killed by sniper fire during Atlas's second deployment, leaving the dog without his bonded partner. "Atlas went through a period of depression after Torres died," Dr. Walsh explained. "Military working dogs can experience grief and PTSD just like humans." The fact that he eventually bonded with his next handler showed remarkable resilience. The second handler, Corporal Lisa Manning, had worked with Atlas for 8 months before being reassigned to a different unit. The rapid succession of handler changes had made Atlas somewhat resistant to forming deep bonds, which explained some of the independent behavior Marcus had noticed during their early months together. When Atlas was being transported to his new assignment, he was essentially starting over with a third handler, Brennan explained. "The accident happened before he had a chance to form that crucial bond. In a way, you became the stable relationship he'd been missing." Quote, understanding Atlas's history gave Marcus new appreciation for the trust the dog had placed in him. Every morning walk, every quiet evening on the couch, every moment of simple companionship represented Atlas choosing to be vulnerable again after experiencing significant loss. The monthly training sessions became something Marcus looked forward to rather than endured. He began learning basic handling techniques, not because he would ever deploy with Atlas, but because understanding the dog's professional capabilities deepened their personal relationship. "Watch his ear position when he's working," Williams instructed during one session. "Forward and alert means he's actively searching. When they swivel independently, he's processing multiple scent sources. And when they pin back slightly while maintaining forward focus, he's detected something and is trying to pinpoint the exact location." Marcus learned to read Atlas's body language with new sophistication. The casual pet owner's interpretation of happy dog evolved into recognition of dozens of subtle communication signals. Atlas's tail position, breathing patterns, and eye movement all conveyed specific information about his mental state and intentions. Military working dogs develop enhanced communication skills, Dr. Walsh explained. They learn to convey complex information to their handlers through precise body language, because verbal communication isn't possible in combat situations. 6 months into their new arrangement, Marcus received his first emergency call. A bomb threat at Portland International Airport required all available detection assets, and Atlas was being activated for his first civilian deployment since the transport accident. The call came at 2 a.m., jarring Marcus from sleep. Within 30 minutes, he and Atlas were at the airport, where they met a joint task force of FBI agents, local police, and military personnel. Atlas seemed to understand immediately that this was different from training. His entire demeanor shifted into combat-ready alertness. "Mr. Chen, Atlas will be working with Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI," Lieutenant Colonel Brennan explained. "She's trained in military working dog protocols and will serve as his tactical handler for this operation." Marcus watched nervously as Atlas was fitted with specialized detection equipment, a tactical harness with built-in communication devices and protective gear designed for high-risk environments. The transformation from household pet to professional operator was complete and slightly unnerving. "He'll be searching Terminal C," Agent Kim explained. "The threat was specific to that area, and we need to clear it systematically before allowing passenger traffic to resume." Marcus observed from the command center as Atlas worked through the terminal with methodical precision. Every movement was purposeful, every pause significant. Through the communication system, he could hear Agent Kim's quiet commands and Atlas's handlers breathing as they navigated the potentially dangerous environment. 23 minutes into the search, Atlas sat and stared directly at Agent Kim in front of a maintenance closet that had been overlooked by human searchers. Inside, Explosive ordnance disposal specialists found a sophisticated device that could have caused massive casualties. Atlas just saved potentially hundreds of lives, Agent Kim reported over the radio. Standing in the command center, Marcus felt a surge of pride, unlike anything he'd experienced. This was his dog. The same animal who begged for bacon scraps and got excited about car rides, potentially preventing a terrorist attack through skills and training that represented years of dedication and sacrifice. The debriefing afterward revealed the sophistication of both the threat and Atlas's response to it. The explosive device had been designed to avoid detection by standard screening equipment, relying on chemical compounds that were difficult for most detection systems to identify. Atlas detected trace particles that had migrated from the device through microscopic air currents, the bomb disposal specialist explained. The concentration was so low that even our most sensitive electronic equipment missed it. Only a dog with his level of training and experience would have been able to make that detection. Driving home as dawn broke over Portland, Marcus looked at Atlas sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat and marveled at the duality of their existence. In a few hours, Atlas would be back to being Buster, playing fetch in the park, napping in sunbeams, and doing all the ordinary things that made him a beloved pet. But Marcus would never again see those activities as simple or mundane. "You're pretty amazing, aren't you?" Marcus said quietly. Atlas opened one eye, tail wagging lazily, then went back to sleep. For him, switching between saving lives and enjoying belly rubs was just another day in a life that had somehow managed to encompass both service and love in equal measure. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.